The human experience, with our flaws, our passions, our triggers, our inspirations, and our imprints. If we could see behind everyone's story, then perhaps what we would have is deep compassion. In this podcast, I get the chance to explore these stories from some truly fascinating people in some honest and heartwarming conversations. And best of all, I get to share these discussions with you. I'm Lael Stone, and this is Humans Being. Welcome everybody, it's lovely to have you here. I am flying solo today and I wanted to do a solo episode all about relationships, our partners, and making it work. And this is, you could do a series of 20 episodes on this topic because relationships are hard work and our intimate relationships are complex, they are tender, they are full of many stories and imprints that we bring from our own upbringing. And, when we throw kids in the mix, we throw other stresses and pressures, it's a lot. So I wanted to just talk today a little bit around, I guess, what I have navigated and learned over being in a relationship for 28 years with my husband, but also from listening to thousands of people's stories. A lot of people come to me for parenting work over the years, but ultimately, and it ends up a lot of the time being about their relationship, being about, what they're, what's coming up for them, whether it is around parenting or just where they're getting their needs met. So I wanted to touch on a few points today. And I want to start by just saying that it's very easy for us when it comes to our intimate relationships to make somebody else wrong. And we all love to be right. We all love to be innocent. I'm not doing anything wrong. And yet I think one of the most interesting things about being in relationship is our ability to reflect, is our ability to pause and go, what is here for me? One of my favorite sayings is, what am I making this mean? So I want to frame this episode by really taking a look at what turns up for us. Yes, there are things in relationships that don't feel good. Yes, there are toxic relationships, and I invite you to be discerning as you're listening around what is healthy and what is not in your relationship. But I really want to take this lens of reflection of the self. I think I kind of come from it from a place from many, many years ago. Thanks to my mum being a great teacher. She used to say to me from a very young age, everybody is in your world to reflect and teach you something. People, you have reactions to people, or stuff comes up for you often because there is something that you're needing to address. There's something you need to look at, or perhaps there's boundaries you need to set, or truth you need to speak. But if we always fall back into the place of being the victim and it's not fair and they're not treating me well, then we're often never ever going to find our power. And so it was really beautiful, I think, for me as an imprint as a child to be invited to look at life and people and humans as these beautiful mirrors to some of the stuff that may be going on in my world. And that's what I kind of want to bring to the surface today. So I am going to start by actually just talking a bit personally. My husband and I, we have been together for 28 years now, maybe even a little bit longer. We actually went to high school together. Here's a bit of a history for you if you've ever been curious. I'm sure no one really cares, but here we go. We actually went to secondary school together. He was 3 years above me at school, and it was actually my year 12 media teacher who set us up. I mean, I don't think things like this can go on anymore, but Mike was friends with her. He used to come back to school after he'd left school and catch up with her occasionally. And I was in year 12, and one day he saw me while he was catching up with my lovely media teacher. Shout out to you, Chrissy. And he asked, who's that girl there? And then, she's like, oh, that's Lael. And then she came to me and said, oh, can I give Mike, my friend, your number? I mean, this is probably really not appropriate anymore in our schooling system. I don't think you'd be allowed to do it, but this was like 30 plus years ago. So I was like, yeah, sure, no worries. So we went out on a date. I was about to head overseas for a few years, so I didn't really take that date very seriously. I do remember it was Cup Day, though, because we went and put a bet on the horses. This was many, many years ago, and discovered that we actually have the same birthday. So my husband and I actually share a birthday. So we thought that was pretty cool that we both had the same birthday. But then I kind of blew him off and, just kind of went, I'm not interested. I've got to go. I'm going overseas traveling. And so I just kind of didn't respond to his calls and stuff. So kind of just, as you do when you're 18, just, living life. Anyway, a few years later, after I went and traveled, I bumped into that same teacher again in Collingwood sometime, and gave her my number because I wanted to catch up with her, and she was still friends with Mike, and said, "Oh, I bumped into Lael," and then he called me, and that's where it began again. And then we went out on a few dates, but this time it looked different. He kind of seemed to have a lot more of the power. He was pretty cool. He was a designer. I was still a bit lost wandering around, and we had this amazing chemistry that drew us together. But he was definitely an avoidant person. He did not want commitment, did not want relationship. And I was probably a little bit more on the anxious attachment vibe of just wanting, needing, wanting to be loved, wanting to fall in love, all the kind of stuff. So we had this push-pull thing that went on for many years. Where we would catch up occasionally, and then he, wouldn't call me for ages, and, I would pine after him, and then I'd be like, no, don't call him again. And then we just did this dance for a long time, as you do when you're young, right? All these beautiful learning experiences of figuring out who you are and where you're at. And then finally, I remember, I think, just saying, I can't do this anymore. It's either on or it's not. And, my heart was breaking, and he said, yes, okay, let's be together. And then we started to get serious, and I think we moved in with each other like a few weeks later or something. I mean, we just kind of jumped in. And then about 6 months later after that, we discovered that we were pregnant with our son, Kai. And so all of a sudden it's like, we are on. I mean, I look back now having adult kids, and I think back to what my parents must have thought, or Mike's parents must have thought, when we just rock up and like, oh yeah, by the way, like 25, we're pregnant, and we didn't own a thing. We were just young, naive. I mean, they were happy for us, but I'm sure they were like, whoa, how is this going to go? So I think, being the kind of wild Aries that we are, sharing the same birthday, we were like, we'll make it work. We'll jump in. We'll do it. I was running my own business at the time. So was he. We were like, well, how hard can this be? That was our story. How hard can this be? It can be hard, as many of you will know. So we jumped in, we struggled. It was tricky. And those first few years of parenting were hard. I was trying to run a business. I was really going through that whole loss of identity. What was it to be a mother? I didn't have any friends that had kids at that age. So I felt very lost and isolated. We were just trying to earn money. It was a struggle, and I'd had a very tricky first birth experience. So I felt pretty disconnected from my son. There was a beautiful, perfect storm going on really around, this beginning part to family life. And of course, then that puts extreme pressure on your relationship. So, like many people do, we go, well, why don't we just have another baby? That'll make it better. We were struggling already, but then all of a sudden you're like, yeah, let's have another baby. And then our beautiful Indy came along. That was 3 years later. And by that time, that felt a lot better. I had a beautiful birth experience with her, which was very healing from the first experience. I was already a mum, so I kind of had that sense of like, okay, I know what this job is. And we both, I think, settled into our roles a little bit more. But in those early years of parenting, which I know many of you who listen are in that space too, it was still really, really tricky. And, big stress was trying to get our needs met. Now, at that time, I definitely didn't know what I know now. I definitely wasn't aware of, aware parenting or just even conscious communication or anything like that. So I felt that my job as a mum was to keep my kids happy all the time. So I didn't really have any boundaries. I didn't take care of myself. Again, a really perfect storm kind of brewed. I was often angry at Mike because he was working all the time, and he was usually working because he probably didn't want to come home because I was so grumpy. And, nobody was getting their needs met at all. It was really hard, and then we had our third child, and, that was an 8-year-old, nearly 5-year-old, and a baby. And again, more pressure in that field. Now, amongst all of that, we managed to stay remotely connected, but, we weren't, I think, at that level of owning our stuff and being real in the ways that we obviously are now, and sometimes that just comes with age and maturity. But it was like many couples I work with now, or families I see, we were right in that the hard yards of raising children, trying to put food on the table, pay the bills, try and have a sense of yourself, and not really dealing with some of the deeper stories that were sitting underneath the surface. And so what happened a lot of the time is we just kept making each other wrong. And I think one of the biggest things that we did at that time was we fought for time. We played the game of who's doing it tougher. And I would be like, I'm at home all day with the kids, and he'd be like, but I'm working and trying to earn the money. And really all we did was we'd compete. We didn't actually support each other in what we needed. And it was really, really hard, and it was really challenging. And I think we both moved towards those things that we do to repress our feelings. So Mike worked a lot and stayed really busy because then he didn't have to feel stuff. And I probably just complained a lot. I was also very busy, just kind of numbing, trying to not feel what was there. And, that was a really rocky time. I mean, we look back now and we're like, oh, bless the younger versions of us who didn't know any different, but also didn't really have any guides to say, hey, there's a different way that you can do this, or let's have some of these big, tough conversations that are going on. And, it was tricky. And really, after we had our third baby, we had a very challenging experience with her coming into the world. I had pretty intense PTSD after her experience. And I went from being able to work and be out in the world to, barely being able to take my kids to school. I was not in a great, healthy state at all. Highly anxious, a lot of trauma, a lot of terror. And everything from that experience kind of crumbled and unraveled. And I realized, that was the part of me first starting to learn to do the work, which Mike then really joined me on. All the other coping mechanisms I had didn't work anymore. Hiding from my feelings, not being vulnerable, all that kind of stuff. I no longer could do it, really. That was the interesting part. The trauma was asking to be processed and felt. So I actually had to turn towards it. And, this was a really powerful turning point, I think, in our relationship and in life to see that it was time to actually get real around a lot of things. The way we were hiding from our feelings, competing, for time, not being as present with our children as what we wanted to be, and I think when you get sick or when you are up against mental health issues, it really does make you stop and take a look at what's the priority here, what do we need. And those years of healing were really, really hard, but they were the absolute best thing that happened to me, because it started to teach me about vulnerability, and it started to teach me about feeling, and it started to teach me about trauma. And through that journey, Mike and I started to really do a whole lot of work on ourselves, but also healing and what we really wanted for our family. And that was incredibly powerful. And so then, we then, I guess from that 17 years later, raised these kids into adulthood and, watching our relationship go through many iterations of, and Esther Perel talks about this, about the 3 marriages. She talks about that. And sometimes it's all to the same person, that first marriage, which is often all about, that excitement and, we're often insecure and does this person love me enough and all those kind of things. And then the second marriage for some people is when we're kind of just doing that part of life where it's about servitude. We're looking after the kids, or we're just earning money. We're kind of in that second state where we're often just day in, day out doing the things. And then that third marriage is often where our children perhaps have left home. We don't need to do that caregiving as much before, or perhaps even if we haven't had children, we're in a space where we're changing how we work or where we're at. And then you look at each other and go, okay, do we still like each other? And what does this next chapter of our life look like? And we are definitely in the third marriage now of where, making plans and decisions around what we do want, for this next phase of our life. And after being with someone for 28 years, it takes incredible work to still love each other and to still like each other and to still want to be with each other after, all the different things that you navigate and that go on, when you have been with someone for a long time. I've been with him longer than I've been by myself. I have spent more time with him as a couple than I have been single. And that's a huge thing, because on some level too, you're also, sometimes there's this boundary of you don't know where you end and they begin, and you are so similar. And what we have found also as we've gotten older, that I travel a lot from work, and actually it's a really beautiful thing. I go away for work for a few days, come back, and sometimes it's lovely. It creates a bit of a missing or longing for each other, which can be beautiful. And finding all these different ways to navigate what that looks like, long term, is also still requires that beautiful work. So that's my kind of background, timeline, story for some of you, if you cared or if you don't know. But what I want to touch on really about, I think, relationships is some of the things that I think we don't often talk about around what makes it tricky sometimes, but also about why we choose our partners. Now, if you have read my books or you've listened to me talk before, you would have heard me say that, sometimes we think that we choose our partners because you're like, oh, you're cute, or you're sexy, or we'll make nice babies together. But actually what I think I really do believe is that we unconsciously search for someone who is going to help us heal our childhood wounds. Sometimes we choose a partner, and, many other philosophers have talked about this. We choose a partner that can play out similar patterns to our mother or our father, or perhaps a sibling, something that has carried our wounds that we haven't yet processed and dealt with. We will often look for that in a partner. Not always, but a lot of the time when we are bumping up against our partners, I'm often always curious as to what is needing to be healed or what is playing out there. So, I think there is a part that we choose someone because we're attracted to them. But then I think there is also many of those themes. And even if you pause for a moment and think about, some of the challenges that you might have in your intimate relationship or that you bump up against, are they similar themes to what you know from when you were a child? Or are they similar themes to, to stuff that has popped up in other relationships in your life, whether that is about betrayal, whether it is about speaking your truth, whether it is about, being celebrated and seen, or feeling like you're invisible, or I don't know. I mean, we can just pick our theme, right? Because there's a lot there. But are there similar themes that you see with your partner of what you bump up against that are familiar to you from your childhood? That is something to sometimes ponder. Now, again, not in every relationship, but we can often see that there's pretty strong themes there. I mean, you can also look at relationships through the lens of attachment theory, which is, something that I'm sure some of you know about, which is really, do we choose people because they're safe for us, in the sense of, if we're scared of being hurt. So do we choose someone that, will never leave us, who is devoted to us? Are we scared of actual commitment and being seen? So, do we stand in a place where we actually are quite avoidant in relationships? You can look at, there's a lot out there on attachment theory around what we come to when it comes to relationships, but how do we turn up in relationships? Are you the type of person that has an anxious attachment, which means you need to have validation all the time that you're enough, that you're beautiful enough, that they love you, that, they're telling you that stuff all the time because you're needing a lot of reassurance that this person loves you and is not going to leave? Are you avoidant in a relationship, which means you don't like it when people get too close, you feel smothered when they keep asking all the questions, you need time on your own? Do we have a disorganized attachment where a bit of both, going on? Or do we have a secure attachment, which is, we have healthy boundaries, we know that we're enough, our self-worth isn't defined by our partner. Ideally, that's where we all want to be. We want to come from that secure attachment. But I guess in my experience and from listening to thousands of people's stories, most of us were not raised with secure attachment. So we come to relationships bringing those wounds with us. We come to relationships with some of that baggage, whether it is that we never felt, seen or validated or loved by our dad. And maybe we then attract someone who, we're constantly looking for them for validation. We're constantly looking to them to prove that we're enough. Or perhaps, we grew up in an environment where we felt criticized all the time. Maybe our mum criticized us or our dad did all the time, and we were told we were never good enough. And then we enter into a relationship, and whenever our partner says something around, you haven't done that right, or you didn't pack the dishwasher the right way, all of a sudden we completely lose it because we're back being that child told that, we're not good enough again, and all those feelings come pouring out. So there's many combinations of this, many combinations of this. For me, growing up as a very good girl, which is not so much my family, but I think just culture and society, really took on that good girl persona of trying to keep everybody happy all the time. What that played out with in my early relationship with Mike is often if he got angry or upset, I would just completely collapse. I was not able to hold my center when something wasn't okay. So as soon as he would say something that he wasn't happy about, or something that, we were having an argument, I would just start crying and completely collapse. And it was like I was a little girl. I didn't have any power. I wasn't able to hold my center. I wasn't able to stand there and say, hey, actually, it doesn't feel cool for me. And that was a big thing for me to start to uncover, that I had a huge piece there within me of not being able to know how to stand in uncomfortableness, of not being able to have a conversation that was tricky and not collapse and lose myself. And that was just a product, I think, of my upbringing, of not ever being role models, healthy arguments or conversations that were tricky. It was never modeled or shown to me. It was either kind of, we just don't talk about it, or it's turned the other way, or we just kind of collapse. I just kept everybody happy. So it was something I really had to lean in and work with around, how do I stand my center in uncomfortable situations? Because my habit was to just acquiesce to whatever anybody wanted, or to make it okay, or to overcompensate, or to say, no, it doesn't matter, when actually it did matter. But I just, would keep the peace all the time. Now, I know many women do that, right? Because we've been trained to be very good girls. And I also know that many men I've worked with too have those huge triggers around being judged, or being mocked, or, being told they're not doing it right. And then they get very, very defensive, which can be, again, a wound from their parent. So I think what's really interesting is when we get activated, when we get triggered, when we look at our intimate relationships, I often look at it like everybody is an actor on our stage, and we are standing on our stage, and these people walk onto our stage, and the ones that we often find the most challenges with are the ones that are our bestest teachers. They're that actor on our stage standing there saying, hey, I'm going to mirror back to you something about yourself to help you grow. And they do an excellent job of it, especially if they just annoy the absolute crap out of you, then you can guarantee that they're doing their job well. And my invitation in those moments is for us to be able to go, what am I making this mean? What is this about for me? And again, I really want to reiterate, if someone's treating you poorly, if you are in harm's way, if someone's saying really awful things to you, then I invite you to set a boundary and say, no, that is not acceptable. Maybe you need to leave. Maybe you need to get more support in. I am not saying that in all dynamics we need to stand for toxic, crappy behavior, because that is not okay. Sometimes the smartest thing we can do is actually walk away and say, that is not wisdom for me. And so I invite you to be discerning about that, right? I am not saying that we need to stand in, crappy relationships and just take it. But what I am asking, or what I am inviting you to think about, is those places where we get activated, where we lose our center, and we like to point towards the other person and say things like, if only you did this and if only you did that, then my life would be better. That is where I invite you to pause and think about, what is here for me? Does this dynamic remind me of something from when I was younger? Is this familiar to me, this pattern? Does it turn up in my life? And what are really the big feelings that might be sitting there for me? When my partner says they're coming home at 8:00 and then they don't, and then it's 9:15 and we've spent 45 minutes stewing because they were going to be home at 8:00 and they didn't ring, have we then made this massive story in our head that if he loved me, then he would call me and tell me he's coming home, or he would be home on time? Or do we just spiral into a whole story as to what that is? And then by the time they get home, we are pissed off and we are throwing daggers at them with our looks. And, we're totally in this story. And really, actually what's going on, maybe they had to help a mate, or there was a car accident, or who knows what's going on, or maybe they did lose track of time, right? And maybe they can just apologize and it's all right. But if we are activated and in our story, then I'm asking you to go, what is that story there? And maybe behind the story that says, if you respected me, then you would call. But I would invite you to go a bit further than that. What's sitting behind that? Is there a story that says, I don't feel worthy and valued? Is there a story for you that comes up of, I don't feel lovable in my life, and is that related to these younger wounds that might be surfacing? I mean, again, if you've listened to my work, you know that I often ask the question, how old do I feel right now? And this can be a really good thing to do when we're in the middle of something going on with our partner and we're feeling those big feelings going on, is to ask ourselves, how old do I feel? Do I feel like the embodied adult in this moment? And odds are if we're getting upset or we're getting angry, we're not. Usually we're the child. And if I'm to pause or take a step back for a minute and ask myself, how old do I feel right now? Then maybe we get a sense, I feel like I'm a little kid, or I feel like I'm an angry teenager, or I feel like I'm a young adult who doesn't know what to do. And it's from there that we might be able to pause and lean into what else might be happening for me here. What is surfacing for me in this moment? With my partner not coming home, I've made it mean that they're disrespectful, but actually behind that, there is maybe a deeper wound there that says nobody sees me. Where does that story come from? And how old is that person that's feeling that? And what words and compassion and holding does that part need? Can we, in those moments, acknowledge there's a part of me that feels not seen? And that part of me has been alive for a really, really long time. And where does that come from? Well, maybe it comes from parents who I feel like didn't really see or acknowledge me. They were too busy with my brother, or they were too busy working, or they were just in their own trauma and pain and couldn't turn towards me. So I felt invisible and like I don't matter most of my life. Maybe that's where we get to. And in that moment, what can we do? Well, we can give ourselves some love. We can allow the wise adult part of us to hold the younger part of us and say some beautiful words like, I hear you, and I'm sorry that you never felt seen, and I'm with you. And then maybe what we do is we are able to then, when we're calm, say to our partner, when you didn't come home or you didn't call me, I made it mean that you don't care about me, or I made it mean that you don't love me. And, that's what I was holding. That's what's there for me. Now, when we can own that, when we can say, I was making it mean this, or this is what came up for me, then what we do in that moment is we create an opportunity to have a conversation which isn't about blame, which isn't about, but I've been working all day and, I just wanted to catch up with my friend, or, I was just trying to help someone. And instead of getting into the, tit for tat over who's right and who's wrong, can we actually drop into our hearts and go, hey, this is the pain that was sitting there for me in this moment. This is what got activated in me. And how could we do it differently next time? If you're running late, I'd really love if you could just text and say, hey, I'm going to be this late. Or I will also work on not creating a story around what that might mean in those moments. There are many combinations of that conversation, right? And again, I really invite you to think about when we are having disagreements in relationships and when we are pushing up against each other, there is always an invitation for us to take a step back and ask ourselves, what am I making this mean in this moment? What is here for me? What is the gift of this experience right now? What is it that is a theme that keeps popping up here? And what do I need to do to work on that? Because as soon as we kind of turn towards the other person and we use sentences like, if you just did this, or why can't you do it like that? Or if we just keep pointing the finger and blaming about what they're not doing right, then often we are missing something that we are bringing to that dynamic as well. And again, I'm going to invite you to be discerning. Sometimes people can treat people poorly, and sometimes it's actually that's not okay. That's non-negotiable. I'm not willing to be spoken to that way, or I am not going to tolerate that. And sometimes we need to make big decisions and set boundaries. But in those moments where we keep bumping up against each other, I really invite you to be looking at what is here for me. What am I making this mean? What is this about? And from there, sometimes we need to create changes. Sometimes we need to have tough conversations. Sometimes we need to get some support, for somebody to hold space for us to look at what might be there within it. I think, again, when we play that game of who's doing it tougher, so who's working more, who's not getting a break, when we are making our partners wrong all the time, it's coming from a place of defense within us. It's coming from a place of usually where we're not getting our needs met or we're not feeling seen. And I think the stepping stones for that is to be able to pause and to lean into what our stories might be there, so we can actually see what we need to heal or bring to the table. Now, sometimes it might be a little bit, sometimes it might not be, it might be a lot. But I think when we're looking at partnership and we look at something like doing the work, the invitation is always to be there around what is my part in this scenario here. And sometimes even if we're being treated really poorly by someone, part of the lesson may be I'm allowing myself to be treated this way. And I actually need to set a boundary, or I actually need to step away from this dynamic or relationship. We have a part to play in this as well. And so, and again, please hear me clearly. I'm not talking about that anybody is in abusive relationships. They want that. Of course you don't want that. And sometimes the hardest thing is actually to be brave enough to say, no, this is not okay. But often in those dynamics, they are stories that are sometimes repeating from when we were younger or from situations we've been in. And sometimes what we need is support for ourselves to know that we are worthy of not being treated that way, and stepping away and finding it. And I guess my invitation in this is to be curious about what is our part in this dynamic here? What is going on here? Where do we need to set a limit? Where do we need to stop? Where do we need to take ownership for what might be going on in our bigger picture? Now, in those times too, it can feel very hard to be loving and compassionate and want to be intimate with our partners when we're feeling all those big things. And again, what I have found that can be very helpful, particularly over all these years, of when I'm in a place where I'm like, Mike's not telling me he loves me, or he's not, being kind to me, or he's not acknowledging me. Again, often the invitation is, am I acknowledging myself? Am I being kind to myself? Am I actually being kind to him? A lot of the times, when I would get pissed off around our dynamic, and it would often be because I was expecting him to respond to me in a way that I actually wasn't responding to him. I wasn't being very kind and generous and loving towards him, but that's what I expected him to do back to me. And so sometimes, again, I had to really check myself. What is here? What do I need to work with? What do I need to stand in? What am I bringing to this dynamic as well? I think they're really good conversations to be asking. What am I bringing here? What is being asked of me in these deeper, bigger pictures here? I mean, we also, I think, need to look at what was imprinted to us in our relationships growing up. What did you watch in your family of origin? How did you watch relationships play out, whether it was your grandparents, whether it was your parents, whether you had a step parent, maybe you grew up in a single parent family. What is it that you watched around relationships? What became your imprint? Did you grow up in a family where there was a lot of yelling, and that has become a story that, yelling at someone means you care and you love them and show passion, right? Is that part of your story? Or did you grow up in it with a family that basically never dealt with anything? They just pushed it under the rug, and that has become your imprint of when things feel hard, we just kind of turn the other way and we don't talk about it. Or, did you grow up in a family watching one of your parents blame the other parent all the time, and that became a story that you've taken on board? These are all really beautiful things to be curious about. What was my imprint around intimate relationships? What did I watch? What did I hear? What have I made that mean in my life as well when it comes to how I interact with others? And are those patterns turning up now in my life? Were you modeled healthy conflict resolution? Probably the answer to that is no, because not many people did. But when adults had disagreements, how did they handle it? Were they still respectful? Did they work through it together? Or was there just a lot of blame, a lot of yelling? Was there violence? Was there aggression? What was modeled in that? And sometimes we grow up in families like that and it feels deeply unsafe. So then we move into relationships where we never cause waves, or we never have any anger, or we never, we don't disagree around everything because that feels too confronting. There are so many, again, dynamics that can go on in these bigger pictures here. So the invitation of this little podcast here is to get curious, to think about what was modeled to you growing up from your family of origin around imprints, around relationships. Is it similar to the relationship you are in now? Can you see the patterns that may have played out in your family of origin in your relationship? Maybe not. Can you get curious about what are the things that you bump heads against with your intimate partner if you have one. What are the issues that keep popping up? What are the places where they still feel sticky? And what is the story for you around that? Is it about not being seen? Is it not being respected? Is it about not being heard? Is it about not being supported? I mean, all the things. And we all have this, right? We all have this. So that is my invitation to this podcast, to get curious around those sticky bits. Relationships take work. My goodness, they take work. But for me, part of the work is us doing our own inner work. It is so much about us doing our own inner work, processing it. Maybe that's with therapy. Maybe it's with a listening partner. Maybe it's journaling, or, maybe it's listening to this podcast, whatever helps you. But in looking at those stories, looking at what is there for you, owning our piece so that when we do have a conversation, we can meet each other not from a place of blame, but from a place of, I am realizing I am doing this, or I am realizing I'm making it mean this, and it makes me then feel that. Can we talk about how that looks for you? How do we all get our needs met in this situation? How can we actually support and be tender and kind to each other instead of competing? We've got young kids, which can often feel the most challenging, when we're both stretched physically and emotionally, with little people. How do we do this so that we can be the best versions of ourselves? Do we need to outsource some support? Do we need to make some changes in our lives? How do we turn up and be the best that we can be for our kiddos? Because again, our beautiful children, if you have them, are watching, and their imprint of relationship is going to come from watching you guys. Now, there's one more part of this relationship, and again, this could be a 10-part podcast, right? Because there's so many elements around relationships, and I just wanted to just do an overall, let's touch on what might be there for us in our relationships. But probably the number one question I get asked all the time when it comes to relationships is, how do I make my partner do the work? Or what if they don't want to do the work? And I wish I had a magic answer for this question, but I don't. But what I have learned is this: we can't ever make someone do the work. We are all on our own individual journey. We are all, I do believe, kind of doing the best we can with the tools we have, with the protection we have in place. I mean, I often always say, if you could see a person and then see behind them and see their whole story, you'd probably have a much greater understanding as to why they behave the way they do. I say this all the time, but we are always coming from protection. We are always trying to keep ourselves safe, right? As humans, whether we've been hurt in relationships, whether we've navigated abuse, whether we've been laughed at, whatever it has been, the human part of us is always trying to keep ourselves safe. And sometimes that's by keeping our hearts protected. Sometimes that's by criticizing and judging. Sometimes that's by controlling. Now, none of those things feel good, right? Of course, they don't feel good. But the reason why I'm saying that is when we're looking at partnership, and we're definitely looking at things that pop up, and particularly if we're looking at our partner and thinking, if only they would deal with their crap, or if only they did that. Well, the first place I invite you to look at is they are probably doing the best they can with what they've got at the time, right? And understanding their story and where they've come from. Are they just standing in that place of protection? Now, when we can actually look at them as not making them wrong, but actually look at them through the lens of compassion for where they are, well, then we bring a different energy to wanting to work on the relationship. Because as soon as we make our partner wrong and we, making them do the work, well then, unless that person really wants to do the work, often it won't stick and often it won't land. And that's tricky, right? It's really tricky. Because of course we want our relationships to work, especially if we have children or, we have built a future together. But when we are at that place where we want them to do the work and maybe they're not turning up, well, then what we have to ask ourselves firstly is, can we create enough safety in our dynamic to have that conversation? Can we not make them wrong in not doing that work? But how can we work together to open up this conversation about growing together? How do we create enough safety for you to be able to say, this is how I feel in this dynamic? Maybe I don't feel sane. Maybe I feel concerned about how we're parenting. Maybe it's about, just not feeling loved or adored or desired or all those kind of things. Like, where is that? I mean, the only way through often when in relationships is to have these uncomfortable conversations. And so often we turn away from them because we're scared of what might happen or because it's uncomfortable, because it is uncomfortable. But sometimes the greatest thing we can do is actually speak what's not spoken. Ideally, we need to pick our time. We need to make sure that it's safe enough to actually do that. But sometimes it's about having these really tricky conversations. When it comes to wanting our partners to do the work, yes, you can send them the podcast and leave them the books to read and suggest, some great groups that they could join. And maybe that will work and maybe it won't. So yes, you can provide the support, but we have to let go of the attachment that they're going to do the work. And then, and I know this feels tricky, is sometimes all we can do is do our own work, is keep working on ourselves, keep leaning into what part is there, keep doing our growing. And then often I find what will happen is this, either one of two things will happen. One, actually, it's three things that happen. One is we do our own inner work and we keep expanding and we keep growing and we keep owning and we keep creating enough safety in our dynamic that our partner then joins us and they lean in and we kind of grow together. So that is one option, which I think is the option we all want, right? Two is we don't really do our work and we stay small to keep our partner safe, which means we stay small and we don't bring up these uncomfortable conversations and we don't lean towards them in order to keep the peace. And we kind of both stay small. And often what happens in that dynamic, I find, is that we get sick or we get resentful or, sometimes it can play out with our children, or it doesn't usually feel good because we end up having to numb ourselves a lot because we know we're probably not living in alignment with where we really want to be. Sometimes that's what we have to do for safety. Sometimes that's what we do, for our children. Or the third option is we do our own work and we invite our partners to come along, and maybe they do, maybe they don't. And in that moment, we keep doing our own work. And then usually we find a place of clarity where we realize maybe we're not meant to be together. But it comes from a place of deep knowing, of loving ourselves or wanting to expand or wanting to live the life we want, that it becomes very, very clear that maybe this person isn't the right person for us. And I know that that is painful. And I know that that is not the solution that we want. But I guess over all these years of doing this work, what I have come back to is this, is we cannot keep ourselves small to keep somebody else safe. It usually never works. We end up abandoning ourselves, to keep them comfortable. The invitation is to live our best, most expanded life. And ideally, we want someone to do the same and to journey with us. I mean, I think that's what we all want, right? We're looking for that connection, that intimacy and love. And sometimes we partner up with people because they are mirroring our wounds. And sometimes we come together to do that wounded work and then we go our own separate ways. Sometimes we do that work together and we continue to grow. There's no right or wrong and there's no perfect. Relationships are messy. But my invitation often is about coming home to yourself, doing your own beautiful inner work, because the more we know ourselves, the more we can own our pieces in our story, the more we come to our relationship as a whole person, not looking for someone to fill us up, make us better, tell us we're okay. We come knowing ourselves fully grounded, whole in who we are, and hopefully we meet or we stay attracted to or we partner with someone who also holds that space and can journey together. And I think that's what we all often desire and want. And that is my hope for everybody. But that often takes work. And it takes us doing the inner work. It takes us exploring our deeper stuff. It takes us owning the uncomfortable parts. It takes us looking at our past and unpacking it and being real to be able to move towards what we do want. And I believe that we're all capable of it. I know we all have trauma. I know we all have pain. But I think with the right support and with the right amount of courage, we can transform and have the lives that we deeply want. It just takes a massive dose of compassion for ourselves and for each other as well. So I hope this little touch on relationships has been helpful. Of course, I'm just going to say again as a disclaimer, this does not cover all of relationships. Again, I invite you to be discerning as you listen to this and, please, be discerning and aware of your situation and what works and what is healthy and what is not. Please, again, listen with discerning ears around your unique situation. This is just a small invitation into looking at our stuff and doing our work and knowing that we grow through relationships. So we often attract people that are going to push our buttons, are going to help us do the work, are going to help us come back to healing our own past and stories so we don't move through life with lots of judgment and criticism, but we're able to move through life with a compassionate lens, and knowing ourselves deeply. So I hope there was a little bit of gold for you to take away in here, to lean into, to sit with, so that you can have not only a deeply healthy, compassionate, intimate, divine relationship with a partner, but more importantly, with yourself. Thanks for being here.
Thanks for sharing this time with me. You can find my book, Own Your Story, at bookshops or listen to the audiobook on Audible. I even read it myself. You can stay connected with Humans Being on Instagram, Facebook or YouTube. We love to hear from you, so please leave a comment, question or contemplation. And visit my website laelstone.com.au, where you'll find heaps of great resources and courses for you to explore. This podcast is produced by Nigel Carboon, recorded by the crew at We Make Online Videos, and our original music is created by Josh Reed. Humans Being is produced on the lands of the Bunurong and Wadawurrung people. We pay respect to their unique and diverse cultures and to elders past, present and future. Until next time, stay connected and don't forget to be human.